Hi, good morning, everybody. And I just want to thank everybody for being involved in today's quick take. Today, obviously, as Emily mentioned, we're going to be talking about overviewing user access through ControlPoint, and that covers a few different pieces. Let me go ahead and get our agenda written in here. We're going to talk about the default groups that get created when ControlPoint is initially installed and what access putting a user into one of those groups gives to the ControlPoint application and managing the ControlPoint application. We're going to talk about how ControlPoint security trims user access to sites within the ControlPoint hierarchy and how you can use those users' access to SharePoint sites to limit which sites they're going to see when they log into ControlPoint. And we're also going to cover overriding the default security within ControlPoint using a couple of parameters that were created to allow some end users that may not have access to every single SharePoint site and allowing them to act as sort of a help desk or in another role where those users can still manage those sites through ControlPoint without necessarily being able to access those sites directly through SharePoint. There are a couple of handouts that are included in the webinar that may be of help if you're going through this and you're not otherwise familiar with ControlPoint or utilizing it. The ControlPoint user group section of our user guide details these groups, so if you need to get some further reference after the webinar or you want more details about how those groups are created within SharePoint, that's a great resource to access and just get some visibility to that. And we also have a short written tutorial about the created settings that I'll be discussing that override ControlPoint's default security and override the default security trimming for SharePoint sites within ControlPoint. So I'm going to switch things over to our actual ControlPoint environment and demonstrate some of the default groups that are created when ControlPoint is first installed and what access those groups are going to give end users to SharePoint sites and to the ControlPoint application itself. Here you can see a pretty standard installation of ControlPoint. This is in a 2010 SharePoint environment, so what you see when you first access the ControlPoint page may be slightly different. You may not see this Metalogix Academy information here on the splash page. You may see some charts or dashboard instead, but the steps that we go through here, the groups and the settings, are all going to be identical for all versions of SharePoint. So if you are using a different version of SharePoint with ControlPoint, just know all of the steps and all the settings are going to be exactly the same. So I have up here our permissions for the ControlPoint root site that gets created when ControlPoint is first installed, and user access to the ControlPoint application itself is actually managed via the groups that exist on this site. We create 6 default groups after our solutions are deployed and our features are activated, and I've added one more group here that we'll go through towards the end of this discussion just to show you. For the most part, the main groups that you're going to use to give users access to ControlPoint are these first 3 here: the administrators group, business administrators, and ControlPoint application administrators. As you see, the first 2 groups have read access to the site itself, while the third has full control. And that's going to be the major difference. Users that are in that ControlPoint application administrators group are going to be able to manage permissions for the site. They're going to be able to add or remove users to the site, and they're going to be able to work with the ControlPoint settings that we have. So if you want to give end users access to ControlPoint, just keep in mind that if they're in the application administrators group, they're essentially going to have full control to the actual site collection. They can do anything short of what a site collection administrator has to be limited to. The administrators group would be sort of your default group for users that are site collection administrators to individual sites within the ControlPoint or SharePoint hierarchy. If you have a user that's a site collection administrator to one or more sites within your web applications, you'd want to put those users into the administrators group so that they can access and report on those individual sites. And the business administrators group is a little bit more complicated, as that doesn't require site collection administrator rights. That's a way that you can put users that are just members of a site owners group, or even members of an owners group or full control to subsites or lists below the actual site collection level to give them a little bit more granular control of what they can manage from within ControlPoint. So let's talk for a moment, having covered that, about the way that ControlPoint actually security trims for your end users when they go through and access it. As you can see right here, I'm logged in as our service account, and so the expectation is the service account is going to be able to go through each of these web applications and see every single site collection that we have listed here. That isn't necessarily the case for any of your end users or any of your regular administrators who are going to be site collection administrators for sites or groups of sites. Those users, when you first log into ControlPoint, will be security trimmed down to the site collection administrator level. They have to be a site collection administrator to any of the sites that they would be expanding out through these. And what you would expect to see is that although a user can see how many site collections are under a web application, when they then go to expand that web application out, in the background, ControlPoint is checking for site collection administrator against each of those sites and only displaying the ones that you actually have permission to. The business administrators group specifically is a little bit different. What the business administrators group does is when you initially load up the ControlPoint application, and let me go ahead and switch over to a business administrator just to demonstrate. It essentially runs a brief SQL query against our xcadmin service database that checks to see which sites or subsites that our service account has, or excuse me, our business administrator account has full control to. And what you end up with in that case is that once you expand out a site collection, the expectation would be that this actually security trims our access to individual site collections that we have access to. And it actually looks like we are seeing a little bit more than I would expect to see right here. So let's go back to the actual service account and take over from there. Now, for most of these accounts and permissions that you're setting up through ControlPoint, it's a set and forget kind of situation. You put the user in those groups. When those users log into ControlPoint, even if they log in immediately after adding them, the expectation is that ControlPoint will security trim to those expected permissions, those site collection administrator permissions. Now, that isn't necessarily always the case for the business administrators. Remember, I mentioned before that what we do when loading as a business administrator is we check that xcadmin database and we try to identify where those users have full control access. We can't do an immediate check for site collection administrator access on each individual site like we can for the administrators or the application administrators, and so we have to check that directly in the database. The caveat with that, of course, is that you have to have the discovery process functioning in order to get access to that. We expect that the cache is running pretty regularly if you're using a large number of business administrators. We'd like the discovery process to be set up to run daily if you are, just as a best practice, just to make sure that if their access to any of these sites should change, if they're added to more sites or if they're removed from more sites, that gets added or removed from the application as quickly as possible. I'm going to actually recycle the ControlPoint application pool just to make sure that we don't have any performance issues from accessing as that business administrator. But once I do that, let's go ahead and reload that page. So I won't go into too much detail about actually running the discovery process or having it running on a regular basis because that's been covered in a few other knowledge base articles, quick takes, and it's also covered in depth in the Metalogix Academy. But what I would recommend is that if you are using business administrators or you have users in that group, that you do have a regularly running discovery because it is important to give access to those users and have them accessing the site regularly and having it update when those users' permissions change. But beyond that specific group, we only look for site collection administrator access. So if you grant your users access to the administrators or ControlPoint application administrators groups, and you give them site collection administrator access to one or more sites within your SharePoint environment, those users can then go through in ControlPoint, and the expectation is they would have access to all of the reports and actions that you would normally have as a site collection administrator or farm administrator or a service account, for instance. They'll have access to all these categories with all the reports and actions that you see attached. I didn't mention two of the groups that were on this site collection because those groups are specifically related to the Sensitive Content Manager module, and those are the ControlPoint Compliance Administrators and ControlPoint Quarantine Administrators. Now, if you are a user that regularly uses ControlPoint and you're on this call right now, you may have seen this compliance category, and you may have tried to go into the Analyze Content or Compliance Summary reports and been told that it is a separately licensed module. And that's correct, but you may have also seen an error when loading this that it expects you to be in that Compliance Administrators group, and that's correct. In the 7.6 release of ControlPoint that's going to be coming out shortly, we're actually going to make that a little bit more visible and a little bit more clear for your end users so there's less confusion. The compliance categories that you saw there will actually be separated into the Manage ControlPoint panel that you see here, and they'll only be visible if that user is in the Compliance Administrators group. So if you've had confusion about that in the past, or you've had end users reach out to you with some confusion about any messages they see, that is something that we've recognized and that we plan on updating just to make it a little bit easier for you if you're giving ControlPoint access to end users. So the last thing that I wanted to cover is a use case that we see from a lot of clients. What if I have, for instance, a help desk group, and I want them to be able to manage permissions. I want them to be able to clear access, restore permissions backups, restore inheritance, add or delete users, clean up users that may have been deleted from a site collection or a web application. But I don't necessarily want those users to be able to go directly within the SharePoint sites because they may have information that I want to keep secure. And that's where ControlPoint's security overrides come into play. One of the handouts that we mentioned was the created settings to override ControlPoint's default security. And there are two major settings that impact that, and I've created one just as a demonstration. And that is the ACT SEC OVRW parameter. That means Action Security Override Group. Basically, that means that the value of the parameter represents a SharePoint group that exists on the ControlPoint configuration site. That's a SharePoint group, not an Active Directory group or an individual user that's got direct read permissions to the ControlPoint configuration site. It explicitly looks for a SharePoint group that matches the name of what you see here. So if I go into this security override group, I've created a demonstration user, and we'll go through, and if we log in as that user, essentially what I would expect to see is the exact same thing that I see as the ControlPoint service account. The same list of web applications, list of service applications, and the servers attached to that farm, which in this test environment are limited, but in your environment may also include reporting services, multiple application servers, search crawl servers. You may see, or actually you're likely to see, more than just the two site collections that we have here. But as this override user, the expectation is everything I do in the back end is done as the service account. So every site collection is accessible to me. When I go through, I have the same visibility and access to reports and actions as the site collection service account would be. And so this is a way that you can give those users access to this content from within ControlPoint while still making sure that if they go and try to access this through SharePoint, I'll give you a demonstration here. those users will get a standard access denied message just as if they had tried to go through into SharePoint and access that site without those permissions. Well, actually, in this case, I'm actually still logged in as this, but if you were logged in as the override account, you would have seen a standard access denied message. What if, and this is a question that I do get asked by multiple clients, what if I don't want them, for instance, to be able to set site collection properties? What if I don't want them to be able to actually delete permissions? I only want them to be able to provide reports in a help desk fashion for end users or site collection administrators that ask for them. That's covered in the created settings to override ControlPoint default security document. I mentioned the ACT sec OVRW parameter that represents action security override. There's also a RPT sec OVRW parameter that represents a report security override, which would give the same kind of access to these end users when they load ControlPoint. From the hierarchy itself, they're going to see the same tree that we see here, but if they go through and they attempt to right-click one of these options, anything with this action icon would be unavailable. You won't be able to manage audit settings, you won't be able to change user permissions, you won't be able to move content from site to site. You'll only have access to the report options that are here. And again, this is just a default SharePoint group. There's nothing special about this. You just have to make sure that when setting this up in the ControlPoint settings list, that the parameter value matches the name of the SharePoint group that you've created. But beyond that, the user does not have to be given any specific permissions from within SharePoint. When they log into the application, they're going to have visibility to this, and they're going to be able to either run reports and actions or just reports based on which of the two parameters that you used. So that covers our agenda pieces that I had here. I'm going to go through and see if we have any questions from the audience or any of the attendees. In the meantime, let me go ahead and just mention a question that I actually think some people have and may not be thinking about immediately, and that is, if I'm giving an end user access to security override, what is stopping them from adding themselves to sites? And it's a great question, and it's one that really those end users are going to have the ability to do. I can go through as this override user and just right-click on the project's web application, go into the configuration section, set site collection properties, and add myself as a site collection administrator to every site within that web application. Obviously, with the report security override, that isn't an issue, but we see the action security override probably used a little bit more often than the report one, just because a lot of these help desk users need access to manage or delete user permissions for users that are removed or added to an organization. So the question is, how do you manage that to keep end users from giving themselves permissions? And there's two main ways that you could do that. The first one would be to customize the menus that these users see when they access the ControlPoint application. They may be able to go through here and remove the set site collection properties action, for instance. Managing the menus themselves and manipulating those menus to remove or add certain options is a little bit more complicated than the scope of this quick take. So I don't want to go too deeply into that process, but what I will say is one of our colleagues, Mr. Dave Barnett, hosted a quick take where he described the process of customizing menus, creating a custom menu, and that's available on our customer portal. And I'd recommend taking a look at that if you want to give those end users access. The other piece that you can do if you want to limit that access would be to manage auditing, to identify when changes are made for permissions and report on that pretty regularly. You can set up something like an audit log analysis report to run once a week just for permissions changes and identify those. The only key is any actions that take place through this security override would record in the audit log as the system account. They record as the service account for ControlPoint's application pool because in the back end, it's ControlPoint's service account that's doing all of these actions. It's not the individual user because that individual user would be blocked by SharePoint when they tried to do something that they don't have permissions for. So there's two main ways that you can block that access, but the key is if you're giving users access, you want to make sure to identify any opportunity they might have to give themselves access or view things that they normally wouldn't be able to. And I'd recommend doing that either through customizing the menu or through auditing.